it's very important for leaders in churches to understand when they put the entertainment in, that it has the focus of the kingdom and not the focus of the worldliness and the secularness.
You are listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, a podcast that presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Here is your host.
Hello and welcome back to Our Urban Voices. I'm your host, Dr. Alphonse Javed. Today, I am joined by Temeko Richardson, producer of a recent film, At the Cross. Today, we will be talking about At the Cross, which explores thought-provoking topics often overlooked in traditional church settings and resonates with youth and contemporary culture. Temeko, a seasoned executive producer, director, and writer, is known for her inspirational films that combine business acumen with artistic vision, earning her 8 awards. Thank you so much for joining us today. Temeko, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
I'm so happy that you are here, and these kind of topics they excite me. They are different and they bring different flavor to our podcast. So before we start, please tell us a little bit about you. It will help our audience to connect with you better.
Sure. So I am a native New Yorker.
Mhm.
I'm a tech entrepreneur. So my focus is always going to be on technology. I'm also a sports and management consultant for different types of teams and types of sports. So a real estate investor and a philanthropist.
Mm.
And adding to the categories of, I could call that all entrepreneurship, is also being the person who leads and runs a production company for these films.
Wow.
So I think a lot of things that I've done as a Christian is also based and rooted in the fact that my grandparents, both of them were both preachers and pastors
Mm.
in the United Holiness Church. So from that perspective, I think I have, since both maternal grandparents were there, you kind of end up being a devout Christian and leading into that world. I attended college in Philadelphia. So I went to Temple University and University of Pennsylvania, and then kept going down 95 to go to Georgetown University. So that's really the background. Mostly, like I said before, math and computer science, operations research, systems engineering. So I'm more on that side of the brain, and with incorporating a lot of the things that we're doing from the film and the storytelling, using the more creative side in order to tell stories. So
That's
that's
amazing.
where I am.
Yeah, that's amazing. So to start off, please tell us some about what led you to producing At the Cross. We would also love to hear a bit of your testimony and what led you to filmmaking in the first place.
Well, I think in terms of At the Cross, it was more of telling a story that was based on the uncomfortable conversations that people in the church need to have with people that are unchurched and people that are also looking to be a part of the church
Mm.
and are feeling some types of resistance. And in telling that particular story with At the Cross, it brings out all of those
Mm.
components, or at least most of those components. So it's basically a feature film that focuses and takes the audience through the lens of a bishop and who's also a pastor of a modern day church. And he
Mhm.
goes through dilemmas within the church in the face of trying to maintain the interests of the current members, as well as growing the church, which is a problem, of course, in a community that is ravished with different types of individuals, and types of individuals like the youth who are kind of astray, the people who kind of just don't know what church is about, the people who feel as though the church judges them all the
Mm.
time. And then, of course, the marginalized communities that aren't a representative in the church as well. And it basically striking a focus of trying to not be so relevant that they don't keep God's kingdom in mind.
Yeah.
So it focuses on that. And then there are all little lessons in there about the different times and where people are with females in leadership in the church, as well as the succession planning that doesn't happen in most churches from a successful perspective, where the ministers in charge kind of end up leaving their churches to their children or someone who's not not called, and which ends up leaving the church in a very bad place. So that was the reason of actually doing that particular film. I'm sure there will be more films like that I do, but the first one, that's the feature, is that one. And then there's a short called I Am Him, that just recently was in the 3 film festivals, and that one is more based on male mental health wellness, and we're turning that into a series. And that one's about 2 best friends navigating through life's challenges while they're trying to hold up that mantra of I'm okay, right? So a lot of the things that men deal with specifically and they don't want to address within their group, and it causes depression, like financial situations, relationship problems, health issues, etc. And it promotes that whole idea that good mental health is important in terms of being able to walk your walk in life, and also that you don't have to abandon or take your life because of issues and adversities that happen. So everything's about some learning and inspiring. So
thank you so much for providing us with a brief description of At the Cross, and also talking a little bit about I Am Him. That's really interesting. Developmental things are, I think, that's one of the top problem, but that's not my topic right now. So we're going to come back to the At the Cross. But that's very interesting. This morning, I was just having a conversation with our local government and some resources for mental health and behavior, those kind of things. And we were talking about, but anyways, let me stop that, come back to this topic. So thank you for providing a little description and its narrative arc. Where did you draw inspiration for your characters in this feature film, At the Cross?
Well, most of the characters are real, right? So all of the stories that I produce and direct and write are all about real stories that happen. So I don't make anything up in terms of what happens in the trajectory of the journey of the individual that I am portraying inside of the character. So if there's a bishop that got caught having relations outside of his marriage, that's because I saw it as a grandchild of preachers and pastors, right? So we know, we kind of tend to know who to trust in the pulpit, and who we would never allow to be our pastors, and how that role works. So all of those characters are based on reality of individuals that are in the church. There are 3 people that they are not really characters because that's what they do in real life. So the choreographer, Kenneth Marquise, like he's a choreographer to the stars, and that's what he does in real life. David Daughtry is very well known in the gospel realm, and he is the leading minister of music at his church, as well as being a recording artist. So that's what he does in real life. And then you'll have Marissa Farrow, who's a very well-known up-and-coming female minister who will preach everybody's socks off. So she's that's who she is in real life.
That's really good. A major theme of the movie is the traditional and modern day church. Could you explain how you define traditional and modern? What do you think some of the main issues the traditional church is facing are, and how do you work through them in At the Cross?
So I think the church is facing a situation that happened not just because of the pandemic, but they were facing it before the pandemic, and the pandemic just heightened it. And that's the sense of a loss of popularity and a loss of will for people to make sure that they are attending church. Because church at one point for our ancestors was very important in order to get through adversity, right? Now, and not saying anything is wrong with technology. I think technology is wonderful, but from that perspective, it's the fellowship with one another and understanding that when 2 or more are gathered in his name, that is when prayers are answered. That's when we can call on the Lord and we can get, even though we don't trace the Lord, we know that he's present and he's
Mm-hmm.
hearing our prayers. And that's something that you don't get with the technology, right? So you miss that part of the fellowship with people in the church and what we call that church community. So one of the things, and that's the traditional church. The modern day church is something where it's more about the culture, unfortunately. And that word culture seems to have taken on a new meaning in that it's less about relating to people where they are in terms of their Christian walk. It's more about relating to them at where they are in the secular world. And a lot of times that turns into what we call the modern day church. And you'll see that with a lot of churches where the preachers or leaders or pastors tend to want to focus on popularity over a purpose filled walk.
Seriously, that's incredible. So you are defining them based on their desire to please the culture, that's the modern, versus their desire to have a relationship with the Lord and the community of believers. I'm trying
Mm-hmm.
to understand and trying to bring it down to uh, being culture, the breaking point. One is going this way, one way, the other one is like, no, the I want to be in that community.
Mm-hmm.
Will that be the case? One is trying to please the culture and trying to figure out how to,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay. That's
But
interesting.
I think it's also a change of the guards in terms of the individuals who are in charge right now, right? So we've gone from the leaders who are at this point, they're like the 80-year-olds and the 70-year-olds, and maybe even the 60-year-old, who they were focused on they were focused on biblical teaching. They were focused on the kingdom.
Yeah,
They were focused on making sure you got this walk with Christ right.
yeah,
Now, in that, they also, some of them had this whole mindset of the judgment that comes along with it when you're not sinning and things of that nature. But at the
mhm,
end of the day, it was all in good measure. Now
yeah,
we've gone to, I'll start with 60s, but probably 60s down to like the 30s and et cetera. Now we've gone to this whole mantra of what can we do in order to be popular on social media?
yeah,
What can we do to be popular with individuals who are unchurched and just get them in the church and to say that we've increased our popularity and
mm,
miss the mark on getting them to church and bringing them to Christ, which it's a two-step thing. It's not just a one-step situation. So
yeah,
I think that's where we are right now with church. And one is not worse than the other in that sense, but the focus still has to be on the kingdom. And I think that that's where it lies. And At the Cross is a movie that really helps people understand where they are, meet them where they are, admit to um, admit to where they are, accept where they are, understand that there's room for improvement, and
mm,
to celebrate when they actually improve in those areas where they need correction, and to do it all with love,
yeah,
right? So
yeah.
that's the key.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that one because that is as a pastor of a church, I'm the senior pastor of my church, and I am 43, and I totally see the struggle between, okay, you need to remain faithful to the word. It is a
Mm-hmm.
struggle between the older generation, and I'm actually surprised by your response because being a tech person, I would think that you'll be telling me like, oh no no, you gotta invest in that. That's where people are. You gotta bring them, which you already said there is a place for that too. But I think the sober reminder of let culture not take over your Christianity or your Christian relationship with the Lord and the kingdom focused Christian community that He calls us to build, because we are trying to like how to get the people in, how to get these more viewership, those scores, how many views we saw, and I
Mm-hmm.
think part of that is pandemic did that to us. I remember I was associate pastor at Calvary Baptist on 57th Street, West 57th. It was same thing. We had to learn all of that, and all the younger pastors were into like how to get that started because we were one of the oldest church, 175 years old church. It's right on, where Carnegie Hall is, opposite side of Carnegie Hall. And this church been there. And you're right. The struggle was and rightly so, people look toward the younger pastors because we were more apt to technology. So
Right.
the idea was like how to get this. And I think that everybody struggled with that. How to share the gospel, how to continue the ministry during pandemic. And the way you were to evaluate that growth was by looking at how many people really visited the website, because you're not watching them, but you're just looking at those scores
Mm-hmm.
and those stats. So I think that also contributed. But let me go back to your film. Another major theme is embracing different types of people in the church. How do you approach this in the film?
Well, we approach it a couple of ways. The first way is by having a walk through what the journey is for one of the ministers on staff,
Okay.
how he went outside of the church and was a witness outside of the church without anyone even knowing that he was an actual minister.
Mm.
And going through that and addressing an issue that had happened with some individuals in the transgender community.
Mm.
So in focusing on that and understanding what that dynamic is, right? So one is an issue that has nothing to do with the church, but it is an issue outside of the church. But at the end of the day, we can't just have church in the church, right? We can't be people of God and love just in the church. We have to show it outside of the church. So maneuvering through that, and then also understanding what people would think inside of the church and what their dynamics were as it relates to that. But I think that from a perspective of where we are right now, is that there are more and more groups that feel marginalized by the traditional church, I'll call it, which causes confusions on many ends, right? So especially when you're still trying to stand on scripture, right? So you stand on the biblical teaching, and then that becomes a problem, and they don't believe that they're welcome. And of course, in church, as you know, as a pastor, there are a lot of judgmental people inside of church. But at the end of the day, I think that churches have to do better. And I think a lot of the witnessing inside of the movie and with other people that have testimonies inside of the movie, it addresses that in terms of, yeah, we say come as the Bible says, come as you are. We say come as you are, but we don't really mean come as you are. So it doesn't work that way in that particular perspective, right? So leaders have to understand and recognize that everyone, including themselves, are broken or have been broken at one time. And brokenness comes in all forms and types. So, biblically, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. Where are we as individuals in God's kingdom if we're not being that way and being empathetic? So I think we need to, and the movie shows that we need to teach and show God's love and forgiveness for all sins, and not just a category or particular sins. Right. And because there's nowhere in the Bible where there's a diagram that gives a hierarchical level of sins that are more egregious and get you into hell or heaven, right? So we have to act as that and be less judgmental. So I think there's a lot of part to that. And then also for the youth nowadays are very different, right? So they don't have that whole concept of being married before they have children, right? Because the culture, if we talk about this culture in the secular world, it's being it's more popular to not do that, right? So you have your biggest stars who are having children, and they're having the children without being married, and it's accepted and nobody says anything. Everybody thinks that that's okay, right? I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact with the culture having it be more acceptable to not be married and have children. And like I said, it's accepted. So you're going to have individuals who will not follow that mantra of that quote unquote standard and traditional family model. So what does the church do with that, right? So we can't have people in the church judging individuals who come in that are not part of that standard and traditional model. We have to be able to welcome them in just like they are part of the church community and God's kingdom.
What do you think the role of entertainment should be in the church? People we watch on TV, right? You said they having children, they do influence us and we see them, and therefore culture is changing. Culture is what they do. They are setting the norm. So what do you think the role of entertainment should be in the church, and how does that affect church culture? Why is that so important?
Because there's a need to be entertained, right? Social media, I mean, that has killed everything in terms of people's ability to stay focused on a particular topic or any type of information. So your time span where you reach people's attention now, it's like if you don't get it in the first 5 to 10 minutes, forget about it. You know, you might be stretching it 15 to 20 minutes for a conversation on the Bible, but at the end of the day, people want to be entertained in order to be brought to the church. And I think we just have to understand that there's different levels of that, right? So, I mean, in our church, we have, of course, many churches, not just my church, but we have like a praise and worship team. Praise and worship team. We also have a liturgy, a dance team as well, dance ministry. And with that, with the praise and worship team, people have different responses to it, right? So I remember when praise and worship ministry was not the thing. It was everybody had a hymn book and you sang out of the hymn book together, right? Barely find that, especially in Black churches anymore. You have to, it's like they have to warm up the people when they're coming into church. I have a whole nother side of, I don't get with that, but that's a whole nother thing. I'm warmed up by the time I get to church because I only want to hear the word anyway, but that's just me in my walk with the Lord. But you have that whole concept where individuals come to church because they want to hear the music. And there's like this one church in Harlem that I really, really, really like the pastor. And I was like, oh yeah, once a month, I'll go to that church on their time. But that last time I went, and that was years ago before the pandemic, and apparently they're still doing it. It's like their praise and worship is literally over an hour.
Wow.
So it's, yeah, I don't go to church for a concert. That's not, I don't need that. But for some people, they need that. But do they see it as music and entertainment, or are they ushering in the word and receiving the word? And I think that that's a difference, because most churches now with praise and worship ministries, those leaders are getting paid by the church. So you have to be careful with that, where it's not a situation where they aren't called and anointed in terms of what they are ushering in with the word, and that it's not just a gig, like that gig economy for them, where it's just another gig where they're singing. So, because you could have anybody can sing really well, but at the end of the day, do they really minister in the word when they're singing?
Yeah.
So I think that that's very important in understanding. And then, of course, the dance ministry, liturgy, I think is very important. My pastor, the Reverend Floyd Flake, he emeritus pastor at this time, but he focused on that and brought that into the church as an expression of the word. So that it was not just dance, and it wasn't just a dance club or anything like that. He focused on that always being ministry, even when they came up with that like over 30 some years ago. So I think that it's very important for leaders in churches to understand when they put the entertainment in, that it has the focus of the kingdom and not the focus of the worldliness and the secularness, right? So we have to be careful of that as well in terms of what we do in churches.
And I think the struggle is, again, you have made that point early on about culture, pleasing the culture versus pleasing the Lord. And when you look at worship through dance, they have those who have those in their services. They have taken that from the scriptures, because you see that they were David danced, and there are so many other incidents that you can see that people were so lost in Christ, worshiping God so deeply that they moved. So that's great. I think when we are trying to please the culture, because that church does it, so we need to do it. I went to that culture. They were, but they were called to this ministry because there was something about that. Some people were deeply moved by that. But when you start replicating, and that's overall the narrative in the church, especially in the United States, I think that if one church is doing something, it has to be done in my church and your church and every church, because they are doing it. So whether that is oh, everybody's, does this evangelism thing, so we need to do it. Or everybody does this worship thing at this band and this song. So almost every song that becomes popular, every church has to sing. Why you not singing? Everywhere,
Right.
everyone is singing. So those kind of thing, I totally understand. And there's an element of favoritism within me when it comes to hymns, because hymns neutralize all of that for me.
Right.
I'm not against contemporary worship. In our church, we have
Right.
contemporary worship here. But something about hymns, they are doctrinally so deep and rich, and they are just so beautiful. And when you sing them, they bring everything together. And every time when people take those hymns and put their new tone, and why are you doing that? It's so beautiful already. So in that sense, I have a bias because it does protect you against every new wave of like, okay, now this one song is so famous. And 3, 4 months ago, that song was so famous. So it's a season of popularity, cultural norm that is prevailing even in churches. So I hear you on that one too.
Well,
It's
and I think it's also the situation of where do you strike the boundaries, right?
That's right.
So, in terms of, are you going to water down God and your biblical teaching for the sake of popularity and getting people in seats? So, it's how do you strike that boundary?
So what were some of the biggest challenges and hurdles to producing and writing the script for this film?
Honestly, the time frame of individuals that actually do their that what was in the character for real life, right? So it's one thing to schedule actors, actresses, crew, and things of that nature. It's another thing to schedule individuals who actually do that for a living, right? So all the dancers are professional dancers.
Mhm.
So we had to make sure all of them were not on tour with some artists. So that was a dynamic. The choreographer, the same. David Daughtry, the same, because he's always out about and teaching. And then, of course, Marissa Farrow is always preaching as well. So we had to mix all of these schedules in. So that was, of course, a huge dynamic. Also, when we actually shot this, we were still at the kind of the end of the pandemic, I should say, where it was more of an endemic. And every single studio, every production house was still having people do like COVID testing and things of that nature. So we still had to go through that with that whole staff and all the extras. And one person who was supposed to be in the film tested positive for COVID 3 times before she was supposed to shoot her part in the film. So we actually had one of the characters just pick up her lines immediate, like, so yeah, it was a little crazy, but if there's no adversity, what's life about, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. How have you seen God work through the film?
So I've actually gotten some feedback from individuals who've watched the film from different age groups, which is very interesting. So one of the age groups, let's call the older, the more seasoned age group, which is
Mhm.
like in the 70s, they had a couple of people had indicated and reached out that they watched the movie and they thought it was interesting because the dynamics of where we are from a political perspective in this country, on how the Bible is actually being used against or used in politics unnecessarily, where it doesn't need to be. So a lot of things are what we call belief matching.
Mm.
So they talked about how the specifics in the Bible are being used for political wars to get votes rather than using it for the purpose of God is to, to get to a kingdom. They talked about how they didn't understand before the film how important it was for the youth of today because they haven't experienced any of the things that the youth of today have experienced.
Mhm.
And unlike we're talking about hymn books, right? That group loves the hymn books, but at the end of the day, you're not going to find a 20 or 30-year-old that's eager to look at the hymn book. So they didn't realize any of that, and they all have grandchildren. So they're like, oh, we didn't see it from that perspective. So that was good. Also, seeing it from a perspective of individuals who float into that world and or they're of that community, the LGBTQ plus community, they thought that the testimonies in the actual film resonated with them because they feel as though that churches don't help
Mm.
them belong, and that that's why they, one, don't go to church, or they go to a church that is very pro that lifestyle.
Right.
And then, but they understood that pro that lifestyle as a church is not necessarily the walk with God that he and really wants for them. So
Right.
that was interesting. Third dynamic were actually players that I worked with in the NFL and the former XFL. They watched the film and they were talking about how it resonated with them in terms of their walk with God and what they needed to do in order to be better from that perspective and celebrate the little wins when they're doing things right. And instead of basically over judging themselves and holding themselves hostage to things that they've done in the past. So I think that that's been very good so far.
Yeah. Well, actually, my next question was going to be, what impact do you hope at the cross has, and which I will ask you. But I think what impact you already had, that's brilliant. Even those three sample groups that you just mentioned are the communities. I was thinking about the hymnal. I mean, I don't think many churches even have those hymnal in their churches anymore, especially depending on the building and how hip the church is and the congregation and nuances on that. They just don't even put that anymore. It's everything is over there on the screen. Whatever's over there, you're gonna sing. There is no Bible. I mean, I'm just talking about the cultural difference. And if you look at 70s people, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were born with here's a book. There are two books sitting there. One is a hymnal, the other one is, so you pull it, you open it, you hear the voice, everybody flipping through those pages. It was cultural thing. But now the culture of the churches has changed too. It's that part I do miss, but I'm again part of that group that likes um, hymns. But you're right.
But I think also with where we are right now, a lot of that was taken out because of the pandemic, right? So the
Yes.
hymnal books and the
Right.
Bibles were taken out because of the pandemic because of sanitation or sanitary reasons.
Right. You're right.
In the Catholic Church, you'll find them back in
Yeah.
the pews. But yeah, for the most part,
You're
yeah.
right. So,
Mm-hmm.
what impact do you hope at the cross has? What impact do you hope at the cross has
Well, I hope
or
it
will have?
answers. Well, I hope it answers some questions for one, the unchurched, right? Because it's very important to get the unchurched back into church or into church rather. The individuals who need to be rechurched, who were churched before, and get them back into the church as well. I think a lot of that is very important in terms of making sure that people have that walk with God and understanding what that really means, like having that walk with God and understanding that God is not, he's not Oprah Winfrey in her show where you get a house, you get a car. And if that doesn't happen, he's still God. Because there are things that, of course, that we will go through that some of us will never know what kind of issues we would have had, right, if God didn't step in and
Right.
protect us, and like seen and unseen, right, dangerous seen and unseen. So I think that that's very important for individuals who are in the church or used to be in the church, as well as those who were not in the church, help them understand that and how they are moving forward. I think also a lot of things that Christian leaders need to focus on in terms of bringing people to church,
Hmm.
keeping people, like keeping all the generations in church. And that also helps to keep the church going, right? Because you don't want the church to stop
Yeah.
once, like,
Yeah.
right, once you're 40 and you get the 40-year-olds and the 20-year-olds, then what happens at that point? Because when the 20-year-olds become the 40-year-olds and you don't have anybody beyond that inside of church, then what happens? All right. So the church kind of dies down, and you don't want that, because churches should be a stronghold in the community and helping the community out and
Hmm.
for all kinds of individuals who are afflicted in the area. And then, of course, succession planning, I think, is very important for church leaders to understand that you just can't just put anybody, well, you can, but uh, you shouldn't put just anybody as your successor as a pastor and things of that nature. I think that succession planning is very key, and different denominations, of course, do it strangely, I'll call it. So some denominations, they force the pastor to retire at 75, and then the bishop makes an appointment and you don't know who the appointment's going to be, where there's no succession planning, no plan, which is crazy and insane. You have other situations where the pastor can go on till they basically die in leadership, right? With no succession plan, and then the church is kind of out there. So I think you have too many fluctuations in variations in how that's done, but there needs to be proper succession planning. And I think two pastors that I think really do it well that I follow, Bishop Kenneth Ulmer in Los Angeles, where he had a great succession plan with the individual who is now the pastor, Dr. JP, and that plan was working over 7 years. So we're talking real, and the guy is really called into that leadership. Another one would be Reverend Lawson down in Houston at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church with that succession planning with Dr. Marcus Cosby. So I think having models of what that looks like from a succession plan to make sure the church is not in danger of depleting its resources and its people is very important. And then I think finally, helping individuals understand the importance of the diversity inside of the church, right? The females in the church in leadership positions or having positions, period, inside of church is very important, because at the end of the day, most churches is probably about a 70 to 80% ratio of females that attend the church. So you have to have individuals that can actually relate to them.
Right.
And I think that that's very important. So yeah, so those are the things for the church.
That's amazing. Thank you, Temeko. Anything else you would like to add to this conversation?
I just think that it's very important for churches to understand the meaning and it's important to understand intergenerational. And intergenerational churches have to have the crux and the mix of the ability to reach everybody. So you don't have to be the pastor and reach everybody, but you do have to be the pastor to have other people in position that can reach all the people, right?
Right.
So if you don't understand what's going on with the youth, then have a youth pastor that does understand what's going on with the youth. And I think that that's very important. I think also that from the church perspective, we have to get out of what people see as marketing and looking for money as part of greed, and making sure that people understand the focus is really on the kingdom, not what the minister is wearing, the private jets, all of these things that they put out on social media in terms of what they're doing, and like all the labels that they wear. Like, it has to be focused on biblical teaching and kingdom. And I think there needs to be a little bit more humility in that realm from leadership in the church specifically, in order to make a difference for individuals who need to be rechurched and the ones that are unchurched. So that's it.
I say amen to all of that. Now, for the last thing, because we talk about heavy topics, even in this conversation, many people will take offense of this conversation, because how dare you to say that God doesn't want them to have all of those fancy things. But at the same time, if the focus is not on the kingdom, because Jesus did say, seek his kingdom first and everything else shall be added to it. But that's on his condition, not ours. And but anyways, every time I have a guest, I ask them to close with a joke. So tell us a joke.
What do you call a Bible character that just pulled into church?
What?
A parking lot.
All right. Good job. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show again. That was Temeko Richardson. And thank you to all our listeners. We truly could not do this without you. If you learned something, have a topic suggestion, or would like to leave us feedback, drop us a note at oururbanvoices.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave an honest review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tune in 2 weeks for more honest discussions from diverse voices.
You've been listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, which presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry.